Welcome to Coffee with Joe for Tuesday, July 12th,
Hey, Pete.
2011. Joe, how you doing?
Hey, Pete. Thanks, man. I'm doing good, thanks.
Joe, the last video we did a couple of weeks ago was called Turning Around the Balance Sheet Recession. And we had a lot of comments on that, particularly from a fellow named Silver Soul 7, and people can go and read that comment stream. And then there were a couple of videos that you posted after that, just solo videos on that particular subject. Silver Soul 7 apparently used to be a monetary reformer and is now a chartalist or an MMTer, modern monetary theory guy.
Right.
And he was criticizing monetary reformers for confusing stocks and flows. He wrote us off for that. And I would direct him to Dr. Yamaguchi's work if he thinks that monetary reformers confuse stocks and flows. But then beyond that, there was a criticism around endogenous money creation. We've interfaced with Chartalists before, modern monetary theory people before.
Yeah.
And you blog on Bill Mitchell's site, the Australian economist and MMTer, Billy Blog. And in the course of this discussion, we realized that we had missed an article from December 23rd last year, 2010, on Bill Mitchell's blog called A Full Employment Bill, sort of, talking about the Kucinich bill, the NEED Act,
Right.
H.R. 6550, which we've talked about many times before here.
Yep.
And he's got some red herrings in there, it looks like to me, Joe. First of all, he conflates this movement with the conservative movement, Ron Paul, and of course, interestingly enough, Carl Denninger, who is associated with the Tea Party and is very focused on the debt issues in our economy, came out in favor of the Kucinich bill. So a little bit he's criticizing Kucinich for conservative aspects of the bill. And here's a quote. So the right think this is their agenda, and that perception is advanced by some of the unnecessary aspects that are in the proposed legislation. For example, the elimination of private credit creation by banks.
Because he's okay with fractional reserve banking to fill in the gap between what the government creates during the process of its budgeting in order to achieve its social objectives and, the demands of the economy for money. So that's okay if you do that with fractional reserve banking. Anybody who's read Stephen Zarlenga's book, which he mentions, knows that you cannot have reform that's going to last if you have private people creating money. Eventually you end up with either inflation because there's too much money created, or a war, a battle between the money creators. You got private and public money creators. How would you like to be arguing that point in the Congress right now? No, we're creating too much money. We got to let the private banks create the money. Come on.
The gold bugs and the Austrians are for the repeal of fractional reserve lending. We're for the repeal of fractional reserve lending. Does that make us gold bugs?
No, not at all. Yeah, basically the thing to clear up here is, you go to the von Mises blog, you find, the article by Kaj Brusner criticizing the reforms even before the bill came out, the Kucinich bill came out, saying the dangers of monetary reform, in which they say, as bad as this fractional reserve banking is, in which bankers create credit out of thin air and then and own, assets and confiscate assets, they say as bad as all that is, lending against non-existent money resources, and saying, but the dangers of the monetary reformers are even worse than the system that we have now. So for Bill Mitchell to kind of conflate the issue by broad brushing conservative ideology with it is, to me, unfair. It's unfair to the monetary reformers, unfair to the work that's been carried out by Congressman Kucinich. And if you look at his Denninger quote, by the way, the reason that in Denninger, Peter, remember what I said, the only blog on the internet I'm barred from commenting on is the Denninger blog, the market ticker blog. Okay? That's the only one.
Yeah.
After 5 years, only one. But what I'll say about it, because when he supported the bill, when I read it, he said two things. He said, number one, he said this bill would end the private practice of creating our money as a debt. You see? So that's the issue for him, A. And then B, he says, Kucinich goes on to show how after you end fractional reserve banking, you're actually going to create money, something that Ron Paul and all those guys never do, okay? Because Ron Paul's a Goldie. You know, the Goldies say we just use the existing money supply and whatever new gold comes in. So that's the deflationary thing that when I hear Bill Mitchell talking about, you know, conservative deflationary policies, I totally agree with that. But that's not in this bill. This bill is the opposite of that. You know, you mentioned Dr. Yamaguchi. Dr. Yamaguchi modeled the Kucinich bill, in essence, the American Monetary Act. What he found was that we could achieve full GDP potential. That's what economics is all about, achieving your potential GDP, given your natural constraints, whatever they are, Pete, whatever they are, achieve your GDP potential without inflation, without deflation, and eliminating the government debt. Now, if some of those things aren't important, you know, they're not important enough for us to be out there as progressives and saying, you know, this is what we want to do as progressives, well, then I don't know what is. You know, I don't know what's going on. So I really feel that his kind of broad brushing us with, you know, with conservative ideology because we're for full reserve banking. Now, with full reserve banking, Pete, again, I go back to the most progressive of economists at the time, the old Chicago school economists, and Bill Mitchell knows this. You know, in his other thing, he talked about Henry Simons, those guys, Irving Fisher. You know, those. In the 1939 program for monetary reform, they lay out why we need to remove from the banks the power to create money as a debt, and instead to fully reserve, that is to say, first of all, monetize all bank credits, and then go with a growth of the money supply that's based on, with them it was either the population, okay, grow it according to the population, or grow it according to a series of economic indices, so that you have stable buying power of the currency. Now, if Bill Mitchell's not in favor of stable buying power of the currency, then fine. But if he is, let's talk about how we achieve that. Because that's a modern monetary, these are aspects of the modern monetary theory that don't exist because they're lost in functional finance, Pete. They don't want to deal with the political, economic reality of what's going on out there in the world. Although Bill Mitchell mentions them all. But that's what I would say about that, Pete. The solutions that Congressman Dennis Kucinich offers deals with all of those problems of society that result from what? That's what we kind of seem like we need to talk about.
I do want to go on and address this part of the criticism from Bill Mitchell. When you read further, you realize that Kucinich thinks the Social Security retirement system will present a fiscal headache.
The thing that's not true is that Kucinich thinks that it's a fiscal headache. Okay, what Kucinich says in the bill, when he's building up to why we need to reform the money system, okay, and to turn it around in order to achieve full employment, Pete, because the Social Security system is funded through employment taxes, okay, on both employees and employers, okay. He says, well, we need to have full employment economy so that we can stabilize the Social Security system. We can't have structural unemployment. This is the whole thing he says, Pete. Number 7, as the preliminary. Retired Americans are losing confidence that employment levels will be sufficient to ensure Social Security will have resources to guarantee 100% of the promised benefits. A mechanism is needed to assure retired Americans of Social Security's viability. Kucinich is not doubting the viability of the system. What he's saying is that we need to have a national economy that's working on the goal of full employment sufficient to become actually basically the major driver of the national economy, because really full employment should be the major driver of the national economy.
So really then, the major issue of his disagreement with us, as far as I can see looking at this article, is that he doesn't favor the repeal of what we call fractional reserve banking. He does not favor the repeal of private money creation by banks when they make loans.
Well, the thing of it is, Pete, he seems to conflate the creation of credit by the banks, with that being the government function. Credit, okay? Credit and debt, making loans. There's no provision in here for reducing, and in fact, the provisions are in here for enhancing the ability of banks to make loans. So where does he get that from? You know, Pete? Because there's full reserve banking? Is that what it is? Because there's no provision in here that says the government's going to make the loans, or the government's going to do it. The only thing that the government's going to do is create the money and see that it's out in the economy. After that, the same thing happens that happens now, except first the people get to spend the money, Pete, and then the banks get it, and then the banks decide how to put it all together with investment trusts and that kind of stuff in order to make the loans, in order to keep this. But as long as there's enough money created, and that's the issue, you know, then there's no restriction whatsoever, and there's no need to create money when they create the credit and the loan. There's no need to create money when they do that, because the money is already in existence.
All that money that is created by the government will be on deposits in banks somewhere.
Exactly.
Okay.
The day it's created.
All right. Well, we'd like to see MMTers weigh in here on this conversation, Joe, but we've got enough going on for today, and we'll continue it next week.
All right, Pete. Thanks, Pete.
See you, Joe.
Ciao.